Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and it's time to make Godzilla. Now I've been wanting to make a Godzilla for a while now, cause he's a big prehistoric irradiated monster from the depths of the ocean, and that's f***ing awesome. However, I've already made a couple city-smashing reptilian kaijus in the past, and really, how many times can you make the same thing before it gets boring? Hopefully at least once more. Anyways, there's a new Godzilla movie out, so I'm going to take advantage of what I hope is an algorithmic lean back towards the big green beastie and appease my own desires. I'll start as I always do when making an irradiated iguana, which is beginning with the building up of the bones. I'm building up my deity lizard's bones with aluminium armature since aluminium doesn't rust, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Godzilla doesn't rust either despite living in the ocean, so it's a fair assumption that this is correct on an anatomical level. After all, anatomically correct is an anagram for atomic anal rot cycler. Once I've got my body built out of cost-effective aluminium foil, I can start to slap on a nice thick layer of lumpy gray clay. As is almost always the case, I'm really only interested in getting clay on the model at this point, rather than worrying about any sort of detail. I've been using these wooden blocks basically since the inception of this channel, and while the clay doesn't normally adhere to wood without some sort of glue, at this point this wood is so covered in paint and previous projects that by the time it comes to taking my model off the block, the bottoms of the feet have adhered to the base and they end up getting damaged. To that end, I'm trying something a little different by covering the base in a layer of foil in the hopes that it will make removing my model later easier, so make sure you stick around to the end for the exciting conclusion of this experiment. Otherwise, it's back to bulking out the body before eventually ending at the head, which I'll make by smooshing a teeny tiny head-shaped lump of clay onto the neck and then working my way back along the body, blending all the seams and sharp edges until I've got a relatively smooth surface into which I can start the intexturing process. However, before I start this ever-important process, I need to get the last of these larger details in place. So I'll head back to the head, where I can add an angry brow ridge and a big yelly mouth. Once I've got the shape of the shouting hole sorted out, I can add some extra thickness to the forehead to bring it closer to being a 5 head before poking some little indents into it that I can then fit some little eyeballs into. Finally, I'll finesse the shape of the eyelids to cover up the majority of these otherwise oversized eyeballs, and it's on to making my feet. I'll start by flattening the fronts of the feet so I can carve 3 equally sized toes into the tips and poking and prodding them to give them a slightly more rounded profile. A couple little lumps attached to the inside side, I guess, will be the extra inside toes, and I can poke some big divots into each of the toes so I can fit some pointy lumps of clay that will be turned into great big reptilian toenails. Otherwise, that's the body mostly finished, which means it's time for the intexturing. I'll start from the feet and work my way up, beginning with the little plates that cover the tops of his toes before moving on to the lumpy, wrinkly texture of his legs. At first I thought about trying to carve each of the lumps individually, but the wrinkliness of his lumps was getting lost in the individual lumpiness, so I quickly transitioned into carving lumpy lines with a relatively thick clay shaper. The idea here is that I can add all the wrinkly folds first, then once I've got the whole body covered, I can come back and add the lumpy bits later. Once I've added the scaly bits to Gojira's belly, I can move around to his back and start to separate the segments of his tail before adding the baseline wrinkly details so that it sort of flows towards the tip of his tail. To make life easier while I'm sculpting, I'm going to build out the tail in its entirety before bending it into its final shape. Back to the body, it's just more of the same wrinkling until I've eventually worked my way all the way up to the top of the head. Now that the enwrinkling is all but done though, I can move on to the enlumpening using this lumpy roller that I made to make these scaly dots on my previously made dinosaurs. Rolling this roller all over the previously wrinkly bits, I can add some excellent lumpy detail to Godzilla's body, as well as reduce the amount of sanity I'm losing by adding all those individually lumpy bits. Better sculptors than me would probably add all the lumpy bits by hand, but I don't wanna. However, I will add a few choice lumps here and there to thicken up some sections and add a little variation to my otherwise not quite lumpy enough body. Finally, to make the ridgy bits on his head, I'll drape a couple long noodles lengthways down his face, then poke them with a teeny tiny ball stylus, then I'll thicken up his cheeks before moving on to making his spines. To make the spines, I'll start with a little offcut of aluminium foil that I can twist and fold and pull and prod until I've got a skinny metal spine that I can then wrap in a thin layer of clay and shape that into an appropriately shaped shape. After that, I'll waste my time carving an extra long groove the length of Godzilla's back that I'll just need to fill in later so that I can fit my spine in place. Then it's just a case of making a dozen or so more spines to completely cover his back, as well as some little lumps and bumps scattered around to fill the gaps. Finally, I can bend his tail into the final position and fill his mouth with a little pre-baked tongue and some even littler pre-baked teeth. To fit his arms, I'll make an extra large arm socket, then fit some little lengths of wire into the center of these and cover them in a couple layers of clay, building up the general shape of the arm and shoulders, ending in a little mitten at the end. Then a couple little snips will divide that mitten into fingies, and some strategic pinching and pulling will make my fingies into scary claws that I can then add a thumb to. To texture the arm, I'll break out that roller again before repositioning the fingers into their final position. Finally, some final finger texturing and some extra knobbly bits on the arms, and that's Godzilla completely finished, which means it's time to make his nemesis, Terry the Octo Skull. Terry, of course, is a little Christmas gift, so standard aluminium foil won't do. Instead, I'm going to use some colorful foil repurposed from a box of fancy Christmas cookies, then cover that in clay. If you're new here, Terry is something of a recurring character on this channel, and as the name implies, he's a skull that's also an octopus. I don't know the whole history here or how he functions on a strictly biological level or why he seems to change size so often, but he's shown up in a few videos, and speaking strictly from a creator's point of view, I think he's delightful. He does, however, suffer from the same artistic drawback as Godzilla in that how often can you actually see someone make the same skull with tentacles before it starts to lose its appeal? Fortunately, I think by combining these two things, we can make something magical. Once I've got a freshly baked gray jawless clay skull, I can start to scrape the sutures into the sides and the back and the top. While I generally use Cosclay for most of my sculptures, I like to use Super Sculpey for this sort of work since it's a lot easier to get a natural looking crack by poking at the clay with a sharp needle or knife. I can then smoosh some of that aforementioned Cosclay onto the bottom of the skull and build up the sections underneath that Terry's tentacles will attach to. Speaking of tentacles, I'll start by rolling a little lump of clay into an ever so slightly tapered noodle, then pressing the sides down to create a slightly wonky long triangle. I can then peel it off the mat and start sticking some teeny tiny balls onto the underside, which will of course be Terry's feely dealies. Then I'll work my way down the feely dealies, poking the centers with progressively smaller ball styluses to turn the balls into suction cups before working my way back down again, blending the sides into the tentacle. To texture the top of the tentacle, I'll wrap the whole thing in a layer of cling film, then start hacking at it with a sharp silicone shaper. The cling film will help to soften the cuts from the shaper, leaving a more natural looking wrinkle rather than a sharp cut in the surface. Then I can attach Terry's tentacles to Terry's skull, blending the tentacle into the pre-tentaculated goopy bit on the bottom before repeating this entire process 7 more times to create 8 total tentacles attached to a somewhat surly looking skull. Then it's back to Godzilla's back where Terry will do his attack. At this point, Godzilla's been baked in the oven so he's nice and firm, which will make it easier to drape Terry's plethora of noodly limbs around his back, neck, and arms. Now, up until this point, I really wasn't sure if this idea would work at all, but once I got Terry in place and wrapped around Godzilla in a loving embrace, it started to come together as a not-so-terrible idea. All I need to do then is give Terry some eyeballs, which probably would have been easier to do when I made the skull, but I forgot up until just now when it's at its absolute most awkward. Otherwise, that's the sculpting completely finished, which means it's time to add some color. Fortunately, as far as Godzilla is concerned, there's not a whole lot of work that needs to be done. He's pretty two-toned, so I'll start by blasting his body with a dark green base coat, followed by a black wash to darken the green further and add some easy shading and contrast. I'll then tickle the tips of his gnarly bits with a bronzy beigey yellow dry brushing, followed by a light dusting of bone white. I'll then take that same bone white and base coat Terry's skull with a couple coats to get a nice solid bone coloring, which I'll then brighten up by sponging on a few coats of flat white. Terry vacillates between several shades of purple depending on whether or not I've gone back to look at what I did before, and his feely dealies are usually pink, but to make my life a little easier, I'm going to give his entire body a base coating of bubblegum pink before working my way through a series of progressively darker purples for the top of his tentacles, wet blending as I go. I don't have much of a plan as far as the purple's concerned, but I am concerned about getting purple on Godzilla, so I'm a little less heavy-handed here than I'd normally be when wet blending this many shades. Wrapping all these tentacles around Godzilla seemed like a great idea right up until the moment I realized I needed to paint them. I'll then add some little dots of very thin light purples as a final detail before moving on to my next ill-conceived, spur-of-the-moment idea. Now that I've got everything painted and Godzilla's back is almost entirely inaccessible, I decided that it might be fun to make him look like he's about to blast off a big old atomic breath. Of course, it's far too late to add any lighting, so I'm gonna go back and try and fake it. I'll start with a careful airbrushing of white everywhere that I want the glowing bits to be, before going back over it with the most fluorescent blue paint I own, making sure to let the overspray reach parts of the body and Terry that would be lit up with the glow as well. Object source lighting is something brand new to me, and while this definitely isn't good, it is good enough.
He said it! He said it!
With that done though, I can paint both these mighty beasties' eyes appropriate eyeball color before moving on to making the base. And for those of you that have been waiting excitedly for the past 10 minutes to see how the aluminium flooring worked, it was a roaring success.
Wow.
I will definitely be forgetting about this for most of my future builds. I'd originally thought that having Godzilla waist deep in a resin ocean would be kinda cool, but because I stuck his tail out so far, the ocean would need to extend backwards a fair amount, and I think it would have made for an awkward display since Godzilla would have been so far forward and the center of the model would have been effectively empty. It definitely had nothing to do with me being a little afraid of resin, because I'm not. I'm not afraid of anything. You don't know me. Instead, I settled for Godzilla standing on a sandy beach, so once I blasted my foam base with some fire to deform it, I mixed together some ketchup and mustard to make a dark orange sandy bottom that I can then add progressively lighter sandy colored highlights to until I've got a nice sandy looking lumpy beach. I can then glue the two in place with a little hot glue. I decided a beach would be best since that meant I can still add some water, but I don't necessarily need to use a whole whack of resin. One of my absolute favorite products for faking water is clear silicone caulking. It's fun to apply and adheres to just about anything, and the crystal clear stuff actually has a slightly bluish tint. Also, it's super easy to manipulate with a finger freshly dipped in some isopropyl alcohol. Now, that being said, once I got the base covered in my sticky water, I decided it was a bit too clear, so I figured I could just add another thin layer that I tinted with some greens and blues. However, once I spread that around, it didn't look quite right, so I ended up scraping it all off. Fortunately, it's still plenty pliable, so I just mixed my freshly scraped up silicone together to remove the color variations and reapplied it to the sandy beach base. Once that had had enough time to cure, I applied a thin layer of Woodland Scenics waves over top and tapped away with my tongue depressor to create lots of little waves, as well as add all the splashes and water flows falling off of Godzilla's undercarriage. I then took a bit more of that water effect and mixed some bright white snow flock in to create a semi-translucent white foam that I applied over the tips of the bigger waves and around Godzilla's feet and anywhere else I thought the water would be extra wavy. Finally, a little white paint tapped over the tops of the waves will add that last layer of watery detail and make the white caps on the waves stand out. Then the absolute last thing to do is give my monsters a quick blast of gloss varnish so they're adequately wet looking, and that's us done here and onto the glamour shots. Hey, wait a minute, that's not my sculpture, that's my new Terry plush. That's right, while I can't sculpt and ship every one of you a custom Terry sculpture, what I can do is design a limited edition Terry the Octoskull plush that you can order right now. I've been working with Makeshift to make my very own adorable, terrifyingly lovable plushie version of Terry that you can place an order for just in time for Christmas. Well, like Christmas next year. The Terry Plush campaign runs for 21 days, and if we can place enough pre-orders, then Makeship will make every single order placed within that 21-day period. And the best part, 100% of the proceeds I get from the sales will be donated directly to the Marine Conservation Society, ensuring that beautiful natural creatures like Terry and Godzilla will have a healthy, happy ocean biome for years to come. Follow the link below to order your Terry today, and if you're watching this weeks from now, it's because YouTube's editor's a mess and I couldn't chop this out after it's been uploaded. Otherwise, we're on to the Glamour Shots. As always, a huge thank you to the absolute gems over on Patreon, and a very special hey how are you to my newest patrons, Handler Loves Baby Sloth, Parker White, Dougal, Mindless Ripoff, Caravan Cat, Willem and Anna, Edward Stumpf, Anne, Earthbore, Sarah, Alice McRoss, Fletcher, Borsty, One True Bean, Donnie Dave Jones is amazing, LeFew Cutie Bum, Herbstern, Ashton, Mary, Celine Bean, Andromeda Moo, Batty Wronglegs, Joseph Ross, Robin Feeder, Felix, Patty, Katrin Isafold is the GOAT, Jeffrey Burgett, and I changed my username so Adam would say pee pee poo poo. You are the multiple-limbed purple monstrosity that gives this ancient, irradiated lizard of a channel the best hugs. If you made it this far, then let me know in the comments down below where you think Terry got his skull. Was he born with it? Did he find it? Does it grow like a shell? Enlighten me. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.